Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Bonjour. Welcome to the fourth webinar in our series on the future of the EU-Africa partnership, organized by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Bienvenue à notre quatrième webinaire de notre série sur la relation entre l'Afrique et l'Union européenne. First, let me start with a few technical information on interpretation for our French-speaking guests. Nous offrons l'interprétation anglais-français et vous trouvez le bouton pour choisir entre les deux langues dans la barre de contrôle ci-dessous. Je vais continuer en anglais maintenant. I would like to introduce my colleague Kirsten Schönefeld from the Africa Department of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Berlin. My name is Sidonie Wetzig and I work for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in the Brussels office. Kirsten and I have the pleasure to be hosting this webinar. Please note that this event will be recorded and we will make it available on our website afterwards. You will receive an email link for this. You can raise questions and participate by using the chat feature, and we will pick some of your questions later for the discussion. If you would like to ask a question directly in person, please raise your virtual hand later after the introductory statements, and we will then unmute your microphone and also your camera. It is great that we now have, well, we're still counting. We are about we have about 70 participants, but we're still gaining more and more. And we have participants from Africa and Europe. We have representatives of think tanks, trade unions, NGOs, media, politics, and universities amongst us. A warm welcome to our participants watching from near and far: Slovenia, Germany, Italy, South Africa, Tanzania, and Senegal, just to name a few. And I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers for today: Faith Mabera, Joaquin Tasso Villalonga, and Julian Bergman. If you have a Twitter account, it would be very nice to use the hashtag What's the Offer in your tweets and tag the FES Brussels. So what's the offer? Just there. Thank you already to our two interpreters who facilitate the understanding and the communication, and also to my colleague Philipp Scherer, our technical support. Now, Kirsten, would you like to take over?
Okay, I think I was still mute. Yes.
Yeah,
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sidonie. Thank you for handing over. Good afternoon, bon après-midi. Very warm welcome to all participants this afternoon. This webinar is a part of our webinar series, which is under the hashtag which was just mentioned, what is the offer? And today we are very happy to focus on the question on the EU-AU relation in the field of peace building, and to take a closer look at the proposed European Peace Facility, the impact which it might have on the support of the EU towards the APSA and towards the collective security arrangements on the continent. As you all are aware of, the European Peace Facility, the African Peace Facility has undergone an evaluation in 2018, and we are now have the European Peace Facility, which is being proposed and is, according to us, posing some questions when it comes to the EU-AU relations. One of them being also the question of collective security on the continent, of long-term engagement of the EU, of civil and crisis prevention, and also the question of the balance or relation between military and civic engagement on the African continent. These are just some of the questions that we would like to discuss with you today. And as my colleague Sidonie mentioned, we are very happy to have Ms. Faith Mabera from the Institute for Global Dialogue in Pretoria, who is going to present us the first findings of a research that the Institute is undergoing on just exactly on these questions. Sidonie, would you like to add something before we hand over to Faith? Then, yeah, I see Faith on the here, and yes, very warm welcome also once again from my side to you, Faith, and we are very interested to hear your presentation and to hear your findings on the questions which I just mentioned, and we would be very keen to hear what are your assessment and recommendation when it comes to the European Peace Facility, but also when it comes to the EU-AU relations in a broader sense. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kirsten, Sidonie, and the FES team for giving us a chance to share our findings from this project that is actually ongoing and covers a whole range of issues. So just to give you a brief background about what we are trying to do here, allow me to share. So the essence of our project is looking at the multilateral financing of peace and security in Africa, obviously with a major focus on the revitalized EU-Africa partnership, but also, so that is the first key focus, I would say, but also increasingly also looking at the idea of a trilateral cooperation between the EU, AU, and the UN for a long-term and sustained engagement. And this is very important because, as we are all aware, the debate also at the UN level about sustainable financing, particularly for peacekeeping ventures and features very heavily in this debate. So it's a very pertinent issue that we are going on with this. But starting on what the subject matter is of today's discussion, which is essentially the proposed feature of the European Peace Facility and how this will continue to maybe become more of a dominant feature, or how it will impact the trajectory of EU support to the peace and security architecture of Africa, the APSA. So I think it's important then for us to begin and contextualize this, so to give you a broad idea of the objectives of this project. So there were two objectives that we were trying to realize and are still in the process. So the first one is, like I mentioned, to analyze the various cooperation arrangements in peace and security specifically, not only AU-EU, but also EU, AU, and UN. But this was broadly aimed also at continuing to enhance policy development and policy recommendations and implementations, but drawing on a wide range of perspectives of stakeholders across the partnership divide. And I think it's important to begin where we are. The context is that, as we are aware, both partners, in this case I'm referring to the EU and the AU, are in the process of implementing or negotiating, in the case of the EU, a wide raft of changes. The EU is trying to implement and we look to implement negotiations on the MFF 2021-2027, and the AU is also in the process of implementing the recommendations and the proposals from the Kagame reforms that were initiated in 2017 under the leadership of President Paul Kagame when Rwanda was chair of the AU. So that is where we are. And now the question about the APF and the African Peace Facility as it stands now. So the APF is the main financing instrument in which the EU supports the African peace and security architecture. And currently we are under the 11th iteration of the European Development Fund, which is where the APF funds are sourced from. And just to give you a quick breakdown of how APF financing has featured under the 11th EDF, Kirsten mentioned evaluations that were done in 2018. So that assessment, and this is also, I'm also drawing these figures from the annual report of the APF that the latest one was wrapped up in 2017 and published in 2018. So the picture that is emerging is that the chunk of the budget is going to the peace support operations, 92%, while the capacity building and institutional development, obviously at the AU and the regional level, accounts for 7% of these funds, and the early response mechanism is covering 1.7%. So this has raised, and why you see the large chunk going to the peace support operations can be attributed, for instance, the chunk that's taken up by missions such as the African Union mission in Somalia, and the African Union mission also in Sudan. So this is what accounts, the absorption capacity of the peace support operations of this and the evolving context in which they're operating is what attributes to this large chunk. Then I just want to draw your attention to this. The report is obviously very in-depth, but I think it's important to highlight a few findings from this assessment. A range of assessments have been done on the African Peace Facility. Some have covered the question of relevance, the question of complementarity, questions of partnership, questions of efficient management, and questions also of complementarity to a large degree. So some of the findings obviously are that the APF still stands as a valuable instrument, very relevant in this case, and we cannot ignore the role that the EU is playing in this regard, and it's playing a key role in not only being a financier of peace and security initiatives on the continent, but also an enabler. And this is because we're looking at the other components, the institutional capacity building element of its support. So it's aiming for that engagement, at least in terms of the strategic partnership in security of peace and security between the EU and the AU. But a few shortcomings are that, to a large extent, the 2016-2020 ABSA roadmap, which is what has been directing and aligning the action program, particularly the latest one being the 2019-2020 action program for the APF. Assessments have found that in some instances it has been regarded by some stakeholders as too complex a document to a large extent, and insofar as it's contributing to other broadly stated objectives, such as the question of institutional capacity building. It has been argued also that overall it looks as if there is a lot of fragmentation. Activities and initiatives are being approached from a very fragmented perspectives. There isn't much evaluation from the perspective of outputs, only on outputs, but not necessarily on outcomes. So that's problematic to a large degree in terms of efficiency, the efficiency question. But zoning in more on the question of what we're actually seeing on the ground realities, and this feeds into the broad notion of the evolving context of peace and security in the continent, is also the idea that the concerns that have been raised about a potential undermining of ABSA by centrifugal tendencies. These centrifugal tendencies are what has been labeled, for instance, the attention and support by partners, and even in this case, the EU, on ad hoc perspectives such as the G5 Sahel Force and the Multinational Joint Task Force against Boko Haram. And there's concerns that this would, in a way, undermine the long-term operationalization of the APSA. The third one is, like I mentioned, is the idea of capacity building. And even an assessment done by the European Court of Auditors in 2018 identified this as a crucial issue, the fact that a huge portion of funds channeled by the APF for capacity building are instead being redirected into operational costs. So this was a concern to a large degree. So having looked at those assessments and what on the ground reality is also demanding and the implications thereof, I think it's important for us to then ask ourselves. So the question of the European Peace Facility and the proposition that has been put forward from the EU is that the EPF will now, in a way, absorb the APF. The EPF will take on a larger geographic scope and not only cover the African sort of landscape, if you like. So this has implications to a large degree, and this has raised concerns from African stakeholders about the potential waning of EU support to APSA. This is also linked to the question of EDF budgetization. Then the question also of inherent in a nutshell, the EPF is intended to finance activities under the Common Foreign and Security Policy with military and defense implications. So there's the question then about what happens to the non-military components under the configured African Peace Facility. Where will the sustenance from that come from? The non-military components, in this case, I am referring to the capacity building and the early response mechanism. So there's a question mark there. Then there's the question of inherent risks that come with military support. We have seen that the SSR and the question of enhanced EU military support will mean that there's participation, there's support in terms of training, in terms of military equipment, so the lethal equipment, the military training and advice, but there's also the inherent risk that what if foreign assistance ends up in the wrong hands, and how this is also injecting a bit of tension in terms of the broader ambition of the EU to take on an integrated approach to conflict and crisis, whereas there's also tension in regard to balancing not only its intentions of integration and a comprehensive approach, but on the other hand, what if it's supporting military forces that in some cases, for instance, are accused of supporting or propping up authoritarian regimes, or even committing human rights abuses against their population. So that's the risk that comes with enhanced military support in this regard. And I think also the greater need that's looking at us now is the question of how the EU is going to link its peace and security instruments in a more integrated fashion, but not only leaning back on the question of dominating the security dimension of this partnership, but actually engaging both short-term and long-term responses in this regard. So those are some of the questions that I think we will need to engage a bit more deeper in our discussion. Just quickly, as I wrap up, some of the policy recommendations that I think I want to target specifically, and I would be interested in hearing inputs from participants and the other panelists. So for the AU, I think while now with the new comprehensive strategy for EU-Africa relations being put forward in March, we've seen peace and security and governance and also framed around the broader notion of resilience, continuing to feature as a strategic pillar of the partnership, but also the question about, I think for me, is we cannot ignore the regional dimension. So while APF has also engaged in the regional indicative programs, targeted specifically at enhancing capacity also and partnering with the regional organizations, we cannot ignore the question of the REX and the regional mechanisms as the pivotal building blocks of APSA. So if the EU is committed, as it has indicated, to deepening the partnership along the leitmotif of a partnership of equals, I think it's important to follow through and strengthen it, not only in engaging in political dialogue, but also dialogue at the strategic, at the operational and implementation related levels, and fielding this and pushing through in terms of assessment of the context informs needs. And this is where I'm talking about also engaging the regional levels. For the AU, I think it's a matter of timing. It's a matter of trying to avoid this approach of playing catch up to a large degree. And if we're embracing the spirit of pragmatism, the AU then should articulate clearly on what's going forward in terms of the 2020 APSA roadmap, which is expiring soon, but also how its linkages with initiatives from the AUC, such as the silencing the guns, how those two broad agendas fit, but also the direction going forward because of the time, the climate of reform that we're looking at. For the lead states in their capacity as leaders in their own regional spheres, I would say that. So South Africa, to a large degree, because as chair of the AU, would be important in this case to continue and be more alert and sustain the momentum for institutional and financial reforms that have already been underway, just so that momentum is not lost to a large degree. And also for Germany, I think as a champion for an EU with a shared vision, and an EU that is continuing to also becoming a more pragmatic actor to a large degree in an evolving geopolitical context. I think it would be important for Germany in its very short tenure coming up as president of the EU Council to promote that pragmatic intent in the EU's global strategy, but also inject, I would think, coherence and harmonization of the external financing instruments of the EU in peace and security. So those are just some of the recommendations that I managed to tease out from the beginnings of this project, and it would be interesting to hear also from the wide range of stakeholders and participants that we have during this time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Faith. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Faith, for this very comprehensive overview and insight into the study and the briefing you're preparing. And I think also you gave me a really easy job because you already basically put some questions out there. I was going to ask the next panelist, the next speaker, Joaquin Tasso Villalonga, Deputy Head of the Division of for Pan-African Affairs in the European External Action Service. And I think it would be a great opportunity now to hear how the EPF, the European Peace Facility, fits into the comprehensive strategy with Africa, how it plays along with how it is will be a partnership, a part of the Partnership for Peace and Governance. And Joaquin, also maybe you could take a moment to address some of the risks Faith had mentioned that especially the African partners are seeing in the EPF. So Joaquin, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simone. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay.
Well.
Okay. Very good. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for this invitation and for giving us the opportunity to talk about the European Peace Facility. And also, it's a pleasure for me and an honor to make this very brief presentation and to respond to the very pertinent questions I think asked by my fellow panelists, Mrs. Madera. I will start by making a kind of disclaimer, and it's, as you know, the EPF for the time being is just a proposal. So it means that it doesn't exist yet, and therefore it is an instrument, a proposal which is under negotiation and the council, and not these negotiations, they cannot be discussed for the time being. So that everything I'm going to say refers to the EPF as proposed by the High Representative, because that was that is let's say the proposal that is public. Let me highlight that this is the first time in the history of the European Union that a CFSP proposal of the High Representative was published, was made public at the same time that it was transmitted to the Council as a gesture of transparency, and also to allow the broader audience and the public and civil society organizations to have access to it and to comment on it and to give their opinions. It's a wide consultation process as well. On that, I mean, having said that, let me start with the issue of some of the issues that Mrs. Freitas Madera and try to. Yes, one is the intention of the EPF, or the EPF should be seen as an instrument that has a very specific purpose. It is an instrument within a much wider toolbox of instrument of the European Union, and it's an instrument that is not intended to be used as a standalone instrument, but rather together with a number of other instruments of policy of the European Union in what we call this comprehensive approach. So it doesn't mean that because suddenly we have the EPF, we intend to address every need with the EPF. The purpose of the EPF, as has been already mentioned, the scope is limited to exclusively CFSP needs that have what we call are of a primarily military or exclusively military and defense nature, and therefore that cannot be addressed under other instruments of the European Union. Because this is one of the problems that we had in the past, is that we had instruments for many things. We had even our CSDP, the missions, the military missions, who have been training staff and officers and military units in several African countries, but that's everything they could provide, training. And as you know, training is not enough. We didn't have an instrument that will allow us to also equip these units to perform these functions. Likewise, in relationship with the African Peace Facility, which is the only instrument we had, this was limited to our cooperation with our support to the African Union, but there were a number of restrictions with regard to eligibility of expenditure, as well as very important, there was no possibility to do any bilateral cooperation with an African country, not even at the request of the African Union, which was very problematic. And I will give you an example in the context of our support to AMISOM, which is, as you know, the African Union mission to Somalia, and we have agreed, and there's this also commitment of the African Union to progressively withdraw AMISOM from Somalia. We would like to continue be able to support this transition process and providing that support to the Somali armed forces that are expected to take over the responsibility to ensure the safety and security of the Somali citizens. Today, with the instruments we have, we won't be able to do that because we don't have an instrument that can do that. So the purpose was basically to overcome these shortcomings that we had, while at the same time making sure that the principles and the working procedures that we have established with the African Union in the case of Africa are not only, I would say, not undermined, but that are actually reinforced. If you look at the Memorandum of Understanding on Peace, Security and Governance that we signed with the European Union in May 2018, there is a specific article there that foresees this transition, and it says, in the context of transitioning from the African Peace Facility to a successor EU financial support facility. At the time, we didn't know the name. We were working on it, which is the EPF. As from January 2000, the European Union will continue to apply the established cooperation principles with the African Union, including regarding consultation and political endorsement by the African Union as appropriate. So this is very important because it does reflect this political commitment of the European Union to continue working with the European Union, with the African Union, sorry, exactly on the same basis, and reinforcing this sense of ownership, reciprocal commitments, and increased involvement. It's very important also that we continue providing the African Union with not only reinforcing the ownership of the African Union, so that the African Union will remain in control, in the sense that we will not be able to support an action in the framework I'm talking about, in the framework of the actions of the African Union, of the APSA and peace support operations. We will only be able to consider support under the PFF only on request from the African Union. This is very important. So it is a demand-driven instrument. It's only on request from the African Union that we can consider providing this support to whatever action they present. And more importantly, it is also our intention to preserve the multi-annual programming of our support, so that we conclude these financing agreements with the African Union for 2, 3, or more years, that gives this financial predictability for the African Union. So in this regard, I want to dispel any possible impact. I mean, it will be largely impossible that the EPF will impact in any way on the way we work with the African Union, or that will in any way undermine these principles, which we consider essential of leadership of the African Union, ownership and predictability of EU financing. So very important. What we are doing with the EPF is to expand what we can do in Africa, expand also the possibilities to act legitimately in other continents beyond Africa, but also to expand what we can do in terms of support to the African Union, because as I mentioned before, we are limited by certain restrictions. On the question, of course, very important, and I think Mrs. Madera referred to the ongoing implementation of the Kagame reforms, the reform of the African Union, which we very much support. She mentioned our trilateral cooperation with the African Union, and the question also in terms of financing. We are big supporters of African Union efforts to have access to UN assets contribution for the financing of the missions when they have a mandate, as you know, from the UN Security Council. This is something that has been requested by the African Union, that the European Union supports. I think we are very, very vocal about it. We are even supporting the African Union in developing these human rights compliance frameworks that have been required by the UN to continue considering this possibility. So that's also an area where we want to continue increasing and deepening our cooperation, this trilateral cooperation with the United Nations, with the African Union. And I will not, I don't want to forget that it's also, it will be of everybody's interest that we also increase the involvement of other important partners in Africa, also in terms of financial contribution. But at the same time, I think it's important to mention the reforms of the African Union and the commitments of the African country with regard to the financing of their own peace and security efforts. And I think the establishment of the African Peace Fund is already a good development. It is already it started to work in the sense of financial contributions. It is still some way to go, but I think the commitments of the African Union with regard to this financial responsibility as well for their own efforts is important, and the recommendations, I mean, what is called the Kaberuka report, because it was Donna Kaberuka who produced this report for the African Union, to continue to be implemented. There was a question, or there was a comment with regard, a criticism that we received also from the African Union with regard to the breakdown of the expenditure under the African Peace Facility, saying that most of it has gone to peace support operation, which is true, and it has gone to peace support operations because the African Peace Facility is the only instrument that we have to support peace support operations. That's why where the added value of the instrument was in supporting this, because we had a number of other instruments that could address other needs, be it the Pan-African Partner Program under the DCI, under which we support the capacity building of the African Union, the so-called ICSP, instrument contributing to stability and peace, the regional and national allocations under the European Development Fund, or the actions we undertake under the Common Foreign and Security Policy, CSDP, etc. So we have a number of instruments, and I think the reason why the EPF focus on peace and security operations or military defense expenditure is because the other instruments cannot address instruments. Let me recall that also the reason why the APF is today financed under the European Development Fund, which is a development fund. And when this was agreed by the member states, it was considered to be a provisional solution until a long-term solution was found. And that long-term solution is actually the European Peace Facility. It brings these actions under where it belongs, which is the Common Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union. And it demilitarizes, if you want, the development fund, which is now going to be budgetized, or has been to be proposed to be budgetized by the Commission. We have tried, nevertheless, progressively to move away from operational costs into more capacity building, always within the military and defense area. But this has been proven very difficult because that's where the majority of costs are, and that was also the request from the African Union and from other partners. But nevertheless, we did reduce our contributions, for instance, to the AMISOM troops by 20%, so that we can also liberate some funds to address other requests that were coming from Africa, be it the MNGTF, the Multinational Joint Task Force against Boko Haram, or the G5 Sahel Force request. In all cases, and I think it's important because there was this question whether we are undermining the APSA or not, we are responding to African requests, and our support to G5 Sahel, to the MNGTF, has only been given with the with the consent, if you want, of the African Union, and more explicitly of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. This is very important because it doesn't necessarily mean, the way we see our partnership, that everything has to be done by the African Union itself. No, what it means is that the African Union, the leadership of the African Union in peace and security in Africa has to be respected, as well as the commitment of the RECs and of the members of the APSA vis-a-vis the African Union in the framework of this protocol on the APSA, in which they themselves recognize this treating of the African Union. It means that whenever we receive a request from ECOWAS for the financing of a peace support operation, we systematically go back to them and say, yes, this we may consider this, but we need to request the approval of the African Union. I think no other international actor would agree to this, in the sense of systematically ensuring that the African Union supports the actions that we undertake in Africa when supporting peace support operations, etc. So I think that's important. There is no undermining. On the contrary, there is a willingness from our side to reinforce the APSA and to continue supporting this process. Yes, the EPF. Yes, sorry, I have 2-3 more points. I know I'm taking long, but I think it's important if you want.
Okay, yeah. Otherwise, we can also come in again after some of the other comments. But yeah, if you. Yeah,
yes. Then only 3 points, if you want. First, yes, it will have, the EPF, a larger geographic support. I think this is legitimate. It is also in the interest of Africa that we are able to support partners in neighboring regions. I think that's important. Also, everybody benefits from stability. We will not be financing the civilian aspects under the EPF. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be financed. It's that we are not going to do it under the EPF, because, as I said, the EPF has a very defined focus: military defense. Everything else we do it under under the union's budget. There are different instruments to do that. What is important is that we do this in in an integrated and coordinated manner to make sure that all the different needs are addressed. And last but not least, the question of risk of military support. We have been financing military operations in Africa for 16 years already, military support, military equipment. We have taken certainly some risks. These actions are not without risk. What is important is that we define, and we are working on that, the highest possible safeguards and risk mitigation measures to ensure that these risks are the less possible, that are manageable, and that we are able also to react quickly if something doesn't go as planned. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this overview on the EPF, but not only on the EPF, from your perspective, from the European External Action Service. And I think the very last 2 points that you raised are also very crucial. The question of the EPF being a financial instrument for the, but at the same time being part of an integrated approach, and which also entails civic elements, and the question of which risks are there when it comes to the military engagement on the continent. And I think this, thank you very much once again, and I think this is a perfect handing over to Mr. Julian Bergmann, Dr. Julian Bergmann, whom you also see now on the screen. He's a researcher in the German Development Institute, who is focusing, amongst others, on the European foreign and security policy, on EU development policy, but also on on crisis prevention. And I would kindly like to invite you to reflect on those two and possibly other questions from the perspective of research, I would say, and yeah, I would give you the floor now. Thank you, Julian.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to this webinar. I hope you can hear me clearly. Yes, okay, great. Thank you very much also to the team of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for this invitation and the opportunity to contribute to this very timely and relevant debate on the European Peace Facility and its potential implications for the EU-Africa partnership. I've structured my short input into 3 main points, and also echoing a lot of the arguments that my fellow panelists have already made, but also trying to raise a few other points that I think are important when we discuss the EPF and also its broader implications. So the first point, and I think here I agree very much also with Mr. Tasso Villalonga, that what I would see as a positive aspect of the EPF proposal is that it could provide a solution to, some would say, a trend, others would say a problem, that the EU has increasingly used development aid funds for security-related activities during the last 2 decades. And this is also the case for the African Peace Facility, because the APF has been funded out of the European Development Fund. And also, as Mr. Tasso Villalonga has said, this was always perceived as an interim, provisional solution, responding to the demands that were raised in the early 2000s by the African partners. So a provisional solution until a long-term solution would be found, and the EPF could represent the solution because it's an off-budget fund in the realm of the common foreign and security policy. So when we're talking about the implications for EU-Africa partnership on peace and security, I think one point is we need to acknowledge that this could be the EPF could be a step in the right direction, in the sense that it may provide stable, predictable funding to African peace building and peace support operations and peace building activities, and at the same time contribute to the decoupling of development funds and hard security measures or security measures that involve the military. My second point is, I mean, if you want to secure predictability, the governance arrangements for the EPF, they will be crucial. And I mean, Mr. Tasso Villalonga has also said this is still very much under negotiation, so we don't know how the final design of the EPF may look like. But I think I would stress again that it's important also that we build on the experiences and the lessons learned from the African Peace Facility. One thing that was already mentioned is that the High Representative proposed that there should also be like multi-annual action programs for the APF. And I think this is really a crucial for the European Peace Facility, similar to the African Peace Facility. And I think this is really crucial because having multi-annual programming of support actions would contribute to the predictability and allow also for strategic dialogue between the partners on the priorities they want to set within a time frame of 3 or 4 years. So there could still be the option, or there could still be, there still means for a flexible response to unforeseen crisis, but I think this multi-annual programming aspect would be very important. The second one, I think even in case of EU bilateral support to partner countries, so in case the EU funds activities directly targeting, for example, the Somali government, I think the EU should also ensure that it closely involves the regional dimension, the African Union and relevant regional organizations in the decision-making process. Because in my opinion, this is the only way the EU could counter the risks that Faith Mabera has also already mentioned, to unintentionally weakening the APSA as a systemic structure, which would be contradicting the EU's interests, right? Because it has been one of the EU's core interests to strengthen the APSA. So I think this risk is real, but it needs to be taken into account when negotiating about the governance of the EPF. And finally, on the governance aspects, concerning those aspects of the current APF that will be integrated into the budget, the early response mechanism and the APSA support program, I just would like to highlight that those elements are also very important elements, and that their benefits and added value are maintained. In particular, the early response mechanism has proven to be a quite effective tool for mobilizing EU funding for African mediation initiatives, preventive diplomacy efforts on a very short notice. And it's also often mentioned by EU officials, but also by African Union officials as a success story of the cooperation. So I think this is also important, that those elements of the African Peace Facility, that they are maintained and even strengthened when they are transferred to other instruments. Now the third point, and probably the most controversial part of the EPF, which is the military capacity building part, which would enable the EU to provide also lethal equipment to partners, so weapons and ammunition. And I think, I mean, in my personal view, this military capacity building that also includes the delivery of weapons and ammunition has so far not been part of the EU's toolbox of EU foreign and security policy, and this is and therefore is of a different quality. I mean, it's true that the EU has cooperated with the military before through various instruments, but I would argue that delivering also, or at least allowing for the possibility to deliver all kinds of assets, including weapons and ammunition, is of a different quality. I understand the argument that there's a need to maximize the effectiveness of the EU military training missions, and if there's a lack of adequate equipment, the EU risks to be an effective security provider and also risks its credibility. But I think in terms of justification of this new type of activities, more is needed than only referring to the integrated approach. So what we really need is to know what is the underlying theory of change behind these types of activities. What is the overall strategic framework? And in my opinion, the 2016 new strategic framework for security sector reform, which was presented by the Commission and the High Representative, is not sufficient enough. So in my opinion, we would need a new strategic framework for EU security sector reform that defines also the concrete political targets for those capacity building missions, a clearly defined underlying theory of change, and also concrete safeguards, risk assessments, and strong monitoring measures. And overall, I think what is important that the EU should also prevent the concept of security sector reform from being narrowed down to military training or train and equip. Because, I mean, what has always been a trademark of EU security engagement is a comprehensive security sector reform approach, right? So that goes beyond the traditional train and equip concepts, that is inclusive also in a way, that it also takes into account civil society, local actors. And I think this is the strength of the EU that should be really maintained also in the future. Yeah, and I think maybe to conclude, one final thing, I think it is important to talk about the instruments, but also going beyond the instruments. I would also very much agree with Faith Mabera that it's a very crucial moment for the EU-Africa cooperation on peace and security. And that both sides should also take it as, maybe also as an opportunity to discuss in which areas there's potential for intensifying the cooperation. And for example, I see a lot of potential in the sphere of civilian conflict prevention when it comes to mediation, post-conflict stabilization, the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and other topic areas where I would see a great potential for enhanced cooperation, but also for mutual learning. So where both partners can really jointly learn from each other's experiences. And I would stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julian. And I would like just to take the opportunity now again to highlight the possibility to participate and to exchange with the panelists by using the chat function or also by raising your virtual hand, and we would bring you in. As this is only slowly starting, I would like also to take the opportunity to bring in three respondents to react directly to some of the elements which have been mentioned and to react to some of the arguments. I would like to welcome Margaret Jones from the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office, who's joining us and who's also joining us now in a, well, let's say, virtual fishbowl setting. And EPLO has been monitoring closely as a network of national and European peacebuilding organizations, the development and the political discussions around the EPF. And we have heard already some of the shortcomings, some of the advantages compared to the previous instruments. But Margaret, maybe you can just amplify and underline some of the major concerns you as a network have with this instrument to kick us off for the debate. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you to FPS for organizing this very thought-provoking discussion and to the panelists for offering their perspectives on the subject. So just real quick, EPLO is the independent civil society platform of 41 European NGOs, networks of NGOs and think tanks committed to peace building and the prevention of violent conflict. And many of our members have expertise working with security actors on the ground on a wide range of issues, going from arms export control to protection of civilians to human security aspects. And so we draw on this expertise to inform our work on the EPF. And so we've been following the EPF really since the beginning in 2018, especially looking at the many risks that come with providing this type of support to military actors. And so in that vein, I echo the risks that Faith articulated earlier in her presentation and that the other panelists touched on. And in that view, we've been looking at some questions on the technical safeguards that are needed to mitigate these risks. So some of the questions we've been asking on the safeguards include how they will be implemented in practice, because the EU has floated a lot of technical safeguards, but they take a lot of time and resources to put in place. And a good example is that in the previous Human Rights Action Plan, there was a promise to put in place a human rights due diligence policy for its support to security actors, originally planned to be put in place for 2017, but this has not been materialized yet. So how will the safeguards proposed be implemented? Will they have adequate resources? This is very, very important for the governance of the EPF. Also looking at the accountability of the EPF. How will the EU be held accountable for the actions, given that there's the title of the European Peace Facility, but it's an intergovernmental funding instrument and therefore is not overseen by the European Parliament. So how will that accountability structure look like is a very interesting aspect. And then looking at the impact and potential misuse of this new train and equip component of the EPF, how will it be monitored? And what will be the threshold of violations that would potentially trigger the suspension and termination of this support? So these are some of the more technical aspects of the questions we're looking at. But then kind of zooming out, there's also some fundamental questions like if the train and equip component of the EPF is approved, the EU will join other actors who invest heavily in this area, like the US, the Chinese, the French, but the EPF would have really a much smaller budget comparatively. So given the multiplicity of actors involved, what is the EU's real added value in this field beyond giving equipment to supplement CSDP missions? And then finally, really kind of again zooming out, the EU is a crucial actor providing assistance in conflict affected countries. And we know the EU is a generous donor, but its resources are not limitless. And so we really need to ask, how can the assistance provided by the EU improve human security, be that livelihoods, health, basic needs, education, so that societies can increase their resilience and adaptation to conflict and precarity. And there's a lot of uncertainty as to the way in which the EPF would mechanically promote these goals, especially in light of the steep risks that come with this type of support. And as Julianne said, what is the specific, clear, defined theory of change behind this? So these are just a couple questions to reflect on. Thank you again for the opportunity to exchange on this topic, and I look forward to hearing thoughts from the panelists on these questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Margot, for really brief and precise questions and comments. I think that will steer the debate well. We have another respondent lined up, Volker Haug from the European, from ECDPM, European Center for Development Policy Management. And ECDPM has been very closely following the African Peace Facility and has done evaluations of it. Some of well, the points Faith already reflected on, but also from a European perspective, Volker, what elements does the do we really need to safeguard in the EPF to really offer? And there we come to the hashtag we're using. What does the EU have to offer to ensure the true partnership for peace and governance in the EPF? What elements from the APF do you see crucial to keep up? You would need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, very well.
Thank you very much. I will keep it short with the introduction. We have limited time. I make these comments as a former evaluator of the African Peace Facility. We finalized this evaluation in 2018. And we also looked since then into the lessons that can be learned from that. And quite a number of the issues were mentioned and were raised. So it's really the issue of long-term predictability, financial support, institutional accompaniment, and therefore really working in a partnership. And let's also recognize that this APF was embedded or is still embedded in a political partnership. Now, this contrasts really to a lot of other engagements, international engagements on the African continent by bilateral, mainly bilateral countries, where they do not have this attention given to the institutional dimension, and for which also the EU was highly praised. And therefore the EU was more than just a financer. It was really also welcomed as a partner, also as we called it then, an enabler of the APSA. Now, what I wanted to link from this point about high appreciation for the partnership is this whole dimension of governance. And it was raised that quite a number of issues were not or are not very clarified, but just let's go to the legal base and let's recognize that the European Development Fund has really its origin in the intergovernmental agreement among member states. Now, the EPF, as it is proposed now, has as a legal base the EU's CFSP. Now, this is from the information we received. So this means that the member states of the EU within the EU Council can have the final decision-making power about the spending of this EPF money, but also actions can be proposed by Council to the Council by member states, as well as by the HRVP, with the support of the Commission. So it's very much a process that is within the domain of the EU. Now, Joachim, you clearly spelled out that there is the firm intention to also work through consultation and also to work through regular exchanges. Now, the question is, of course, how this will pan out in the end. How also this EPF will be embedded in a more structural political dialogue, so that this mutuality that for which the EU is highly respected also, to what extent this mutuality also can be preserved. So it's one domain, the governance domain, that requires, I think, some very detailed examination. And of course, the letters are in the end of the, in the text, but also in how the EU, with its existing institutional setup, also the way it is able to accompany African actors on peace and security, is further engaging in that, and also the capacities it has internally to further do this. The second point is that the EPF is really, and Joachim clearly spelled this out, is clearly on the military side. Now, this has a benefit, but it also creates a bit of a dilemma, maybe more than just a bit, because you risk, by focusing with one instrument on the military action, you risk losing a certain complementarity with all the other engagements that the EU will perform through the NEDICI. A lot of security-related funding will go through the GEO desks, the GEO budget lines, as well as through the 1 billion, as it is proposed, for the peace and security budget line, also for the early response, the rapid response mechanism. So these are money flows that need to be complementary to each other. And we know, of course, that the military actors have their own way of working, and the development actors have their own way of working. So when you upfront already separate, then where are the possibilities for linkages? If you look, for example, in the MNGTF, it's more than just support to the military domain. There is also a civilian component. And this civilian component was also supported through the African Peace Facility. So by having like a package that addresses military as well as civilian aspects, you have automatically a process going by which you do not depend on different institutional entities with different institutional funding mechanisms to work next to each other. So it's really about the implementation, and this support that was provided under the African Peace Facility to capacity building, in a way, is also something to happen in ideally within the context of the EPF package. But I do not know how this is foreseen, because it's an element that will remain relevant, because over time, of course, the EU needs to draw back. The EU has to have an exit out of this funding, even if it's on the long term. But it depends, the African side, also on strengthening further the institutional dimension, and therefore accompanying this capacity building on the African side needs to be framed into this approach, the future approach of EPF support. I have, of course, many more things to say, but I would like to limit it to these major 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Volker Haug. And we have a third comment from our FES colleague, Philip Goldberg from the Peace and Security Center in Dakar, who would like to reflect on the EPF and the EU efforts from a Western African perspective, and also give us an insight into G5 very briefly. Thank you, Philip.
Hello, welcome. Thank you, Kirsten. Yeah, thank you for this discussion and being part of that discussion. And I think I just came up with a question right now, and I would refer back to what Madame Mabera was saying earlier on, is how this peace facility is looking into the APSA as a mechanism, but the reality we are facing in the Sahel at the moment is that G5 is considered an ad hoc coalition. And for me, it's not entirely clear how we're going to respond to those coalitions taking place, which are taking a highly political relevance at the moment within all the Sahel countries, and at the same time being funded already by the European Union. So I would rather leave it there instead of stimulating another discussion on the Sahel region now, because I think that would be a concrete question I'm taking out of that. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Philip. I would like to redirect this question and the other questions which have been raised to Faith Mabera and Joaquin Tasso Villalonga. We also had a couple of questions in the chat, referring also to the military, to the planned military engagement. There's one question to the modalities of military assets. How is that going to be organized? If you could give us some insights into that. And one participant also asked whether the EPF is a shift towards from collective security to collective defense. So again, raising the question of the military support, military engagement. And from what I heard in the discussion, or also in the contributions now, this question of military engagement and its role within the EPF and also within the comprehensive strategy that you have mentioned, Mr. Tasso Villalonga, is very important for the participants here. So I would like to first give back to Faith, if you'd like to react to the questions that have been raised. I'm not sure now whether there is a problem with the connection at the moment.
It seems the screen is frozen.
Yeah. So maybe Faith needs a moment to get back with the connection. If that's the case, I would like to ask you, Mr. Tasso Villalonga, to react to the questions which have been raised, if you would like to. You just have to unmute yourself. Yes.
Hello.
Yes, we
Hi.
can hear you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, very much for these very, very good questions. And I'll try to answer them. First, Julian, I agree with most of what he said, if not with everything. The civilian aspects, conflict prevention, peace building, mediation will continue to be a very high priority. Our support, and this is also linked to the question or to the comment by Volker also on the partnership. Our support and our partnership with the African Union is not articulated around the African Peace Facility. We have a joint strategy. We are preparing, as you know, a summit that is expected to take place of the African Union and the European Union in October this year in Brussels, conditions permitting. And we have recently jointly issued with the Commission, the High Representative of the Commission has issued a joint communication towards a comprehensive strategy with Africa, which highlights these our views and summarizes our views and objectives and principles. And you will see there that it is a rather comprehensive approach where the peace and security dimension is important, together with other, and the scope and the breadth of our partnership is much larger than peace and security, and of course much larger than the EPF. Let me stress that again, that the EPF is only one more instrument in a toolbox. That is not that we cannot address the very important things that have been mentioned with the EPF, that they will not be addressed, is that we will not be addressing them with the EPF, but they will be addressed with other instruments, because that is the advantage of the EU is having this wide toolbox and being able to put them together. If we take a region like the Sahel today, you will see that we are supporting very much the efforts of ECOWAS and the African Union. We have a number of CSDP missions and in the ground that have been deployed, both civilian and military. We have as well an USR, a special representative for the Sahel. We have our delegations very active involved. We have development cooperation. We have security and conflict prevention, peace building cooperation under the ICSP. We have actions funded under the CFSP budget with regard to non-proliferation. We have humanitarian assistance is a whole array under a political framework, which is our strategy for the Sahel, where all the actors are properly coordinated. Since the entry into force, and I am also already anticipating the answer to Volker on the question how this works together, of the Lisbon Treaty, we have a high representative who at the same time is Vice President of the Commission, and under his responsibility, Mr. Borrell today, is also chair of the Foreign Affairs Council, and he has this responsibility of ensuring or in supporting the Council and the Commission in ensuring the consistency of the external action of the Union. I think that is very important. And that is very much facilitated by the fact that the External Action Service is also an important or co-responsible for the strategic programming of our cooperation instruments, together with the Commission, together with DG DEFCO, so that we make sure that while each instrument remains, respect the primary objective, the development instrument, the primary objective is, as you know, the eradication or the mitigation, and in the long term, the eradication of poverty. But at the same time, that we are also bound by the same overarching objectives with regard, defining the treaty with regard to the external action of the Union and the need for consistency. So I think that's important. We are actually in reply now to Volker more specifically on the instruments. When he asks how we are going to coordinate this, well, the question is how we are able to coordinate it together with the proliferation of instruments and actors that we have under the new proposal, under the MFF, combined with the EPF, because the EPF is being negotiated in parallel to the EPF, to the MFF, but is formally not part of the MFF because it's not funded under the budget. But we will be in this. The objective is also to reduce the number of instruments. With the EPF, it will be the operational, the programming and operational implementation will be the responsibility of the External Action Service, which is the same service that does the programming and operational management of the CSDP missions, and the same service that is doing, which is co-responsible for the strategic programming of our development assistance. So with this idea of ensuring this integrated approach and this consistency between the different actors, and of course, as you know, the financial management aspect have been proposed to be entrusted to the FPI, which is a commission service that already is doing the financial management of the CSDP missions, and which is responsible of its own of a number of instruments as well. So I think there is a willingness to simplify, to become more efficient in what we do, to reduce the number of actors, and I'm very happy to say that we took some of the recommendations and findings of the APF evaluation in which Mr. Haug was involved into account when we were designing the European Peace Facility, because the idea is to build also on the best practices, on everything that we have learned with the African Peace Facility, so that those are kept. Let me now try to answer some of the other more, I would say, more political questions. And I think Mrs. Jones came from EPLO. I think she really highlighted some very important issues, like the question of human security, and the question of how the EPF would contribute to that. The objective of the EPF is, and that is called why it's called the EPF, because it couldn't be any other objective. I mean, the objective is indeed contributing to conflict prevention, peace building, and international security, and to do it within that framework and with that experience. However, the scope of intervention of the EPF is very limited. It's only for certain types of expenditure. The EPF is not a policy instrument. It's just a financing instrument. Policy is done separately. I mean, there is a policy framework. There is, for instance, the Sahel strategy, or the strategy for the Horn of Africa, or the neighborhood policy, and it's under that policy, which has been done in a consultative manner with our partners, with all the actors involved, that the different instruments will be used. It's not the EPF acting on its own, like outside of any context or of any, I would say, any political or policy and political framework. It is true. It is a CFSP. It is a CFSP instrument, which we believe is where it belongs. There may be certain differences with regard to governance, important ones. As we know, the European Parliament is not as involved as in other areas of the Union's foreign policy. That's the reality of our treaty. That's not something that the EPF could fix. Is what the member states agreed. And nevertheless, there is, as I said, a willingness, and the High Representative is doing it, of informing the European Parliament and in CFSP of taking into account the views of the European Parliament, even if they are not directly involved in the decision-making process. Let me also tell you that it is already the case under the African Peace Facility, which is, as you know, the 11th EDF is established by a decision of the Council, and not by it's not a joint regulation of the Council and the European Parliament, as it is the case of our cooperation instrument. So the role, the European Parliament does not have today, unfortunately, also this decision-making responsibility. So in that sense, there will be little change, because even if it's under the EDF, as you know, actions under the African Peace Facility still require the prior approval of the PSC, or the Political Security Committee, which has by consensus, which in practice means unanimity, and that will be kept within the European Peace Facility. That doesn't mean.
We have some 10 minutes left, so maybe.
Yeah, okay, I wrap up on that, but I think it was an important thing. Doesn't mean that there is no governance. Yes. And let me also, which I think is very important, without disclosing anything of what is being done in the framework of the negotiation, but also highlight the commitment of the High Representative, of the External Action Service, and very much of the member states with regard to the importance of making sure that it does contribute to conflict prevention, to peace building, that it offers the necessary safeguards and guarantees to make this instrument useful and to mitigate and reduce the risk as much as possible, taking also into account what is the remit of intervention of this instrument, which will always be in difficult and unstable contexts. I think there are more questions, but I prefer to give more room to others. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for reflecting on the questions. So you also touched upon the question of accountability and the role of the Parliament, which was raised before. Thank you very much for that. I would like Faith, welcome back. We have, as I just mentioned, we have roughly 10 minutes left. So I would like to give the chance to also to Julian to react shortly. And then I would like Faith, maybe you could give the closing remarks from the side of the speakers.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, maybe just to respond to one or two of the questions that were raised in the chat, because many of the questions that came up also in the discussion were already addressed by Joaquin. I mean, one question that came up in the chat: how to assess the risk of the EPF exacerbating instability, and how do you assess the risk of the EPF resulting in European arms ending up in the wrong hands? And I think, I mean, what is really important is to recognize or acknowledge that this risk is real. But I mean, a final answer to this question we can only give once we know how the governance arrangements look like, right? So I think this is something that really needs to be taken serious during the negotiations on the EPF, and I positively heard that this is really the case, and this is a thing that is seriously debated. I think it will also be important not only to look at risk assessment, so assessing the risks beforehand, but also then when delivering the equipment, making sure that there's really monitoring, and that there's also, that the European Union also has a plan what to do if there are human rights violations committed by army units with weapons provided by the European Union. I mean, this is at least a risk, and I think that there should be a clear, political strategy behind those activities, and really there needs to be a plan how to respond, how to monitor the provision of equipment, and also what to do if this equipment really ends up in the wrong hands, as one of the questions raised. So I think the risk is real, it can be addressed, but it also, I mean, we also have to be honest that the risk always exists, and it can never be diminished to a 0 degree, right? But we have to have some kind of monitoring strategy and also political strategy behind what we are going to do when this is the case and when this happens. And I think I would leave it here due to time, and would hand over to Faith.
Thank you, Julian.
Thank you, I think, to all the panelists. So for me, it's going to be a quick wraparound of all the major issues as captured from the questions that the various panelists have attempted to clarify on. So on the question about collective defense, I don't know if it was addressed, but my response to that would be, I think it would be important for us to view the African peace and security architecture as an African security regime complex to an extent. And this would be taking into account the fact that it's also made up not only of a normative framework, but also the institutional one and the actors. So while the focus here is on the EPF and how EU has been supporting financing, particularly African peace initiatives, I think it would be, let us not lose the bigger picture. Here we're just talking about one instrument, But on the other hand, there's also the political engagement and the institutional engagement that we are seeing, the summits, the commission-to-commission engagement, the PSC, and the Political and Security Committee of the EU engagement. So we need to also look at it in that context. But having said that, for the longer term engagement and the fact that at the heart of the EPF is the question of an integrated approach to conflicts and crisis in the logic of partnership, as has been pointed out. But I think for me also, let us not lose sight of the institutional dynamics within the EU and the AU, particularly the movement that we've seen not only at reforms, implementation of reforms level, but also the question of bringing the African governance architecture and the African peace and security architecture in closer alignment, because this dovetails on the notion also of the integrated approach. But also we need to draw lessons from what has worked with the APF. The questions of the EU, as Mr. Hauck mentioned, EU serving as an enabler and a financier is important, because we need to also appreciate and draw important lessons on the lead role that, for instance, the EU has been taking in convening the support group in APSA, and how this can inform a more coherent and coordinated approach to financing peace and security on the continent. Also, let us not lose fact of some of the initiatives that had and the decisions that had to be taken by the EU as a partner had been driven by a sense of pragmatism and a healthy dose of reality. For instance, the question of capping some of the contributions to the PSOs at 65, and particularly AMISOM at 80%. The question of troop stipends was important, because this also prompted, or can be read as a prompt for the AU to move closer to its goal of self-sufficiency, financial self-sufficiency. So we need to appreciate that sort of gentle nod in that direction. And as for the general policy lessons that we need to see clarified going forward, is how the EU, as Julian has mentioned, as Mr. Villanoga has mentioned, and also as Hauck mentioned, is the question of the interlinkages of the instruments, financing instruments for external action by the EU in a conflict-sensitive manner, I think is the big idea, particularly this notion of how the non-military components that are proposed to be funded from the NDICI, and how that will also complement the EPF is something we're yet to see coming out in the post-negotiations context. So wrapping up, it's just for me to throw a sort of a ball out there for the AU, the question of, we've talked about reform, particularly now, isn't it the time then to talk about review for APSA? Is APSA still fit for purpose when we are seeing an increase in ad hoc coalitions, for instance, and addressing the more pressing peace and security concerns? Isn't it time for APSA? But even more urgently, isn't it time to set very clear trajectory on the roadmap, the 2016-2020 APSA roadmap? I think I'm going to leave with those comments, and thank you for what has been certainly a very engaged discussion.
Thank you very much, Faith. This was already a very good wrap up of the discussion, and thank you for making this last point of the question of AU and the APSA. Unfortunately, we weren't able to have a participant from the AU with us this time due to unforeseen circumstances. But this points out to the question that I think there needs to be more and a longer and ongoing debate also on the question of AU and APSA within this debate. Yeah, thank you very much once again to the speakers and to all participants in the discussion. I think we raised upon really a number of important questions coming from the technical questions, from the governance questions, which have to be further discussed in order to assure accountability, predictability. Then one of the aspects that we were discussing was the question of military support. versus the civic support, and how does the approach of human security still fit in this, and how is that also related to SSR, the support to SSR. What I also take with me, there is a strong sense of, I noted down the logic of partnership, which everybody wishes to sustain, and also the notion of collective security. Yeah, thank you very much once again. I would like to hand over to Sidonia for a final remark. And this has been a very important discussion for me, which I believe we have to continue.
Yes, thank you very much, Kirsten, and also from my side, thank you very much to our panelists, and also, well, to the interest of all participants, and to our commentators who are actively participated in I think, a very insightful discussion. And I think, well, we are now coming almost to an end of this web series. We have next week basically the wrap-up session to all the different sessions we had on the new financial instruments of the EU, which are influencing also the EU-Africa partnership. This debate next week will wrap up and summarize the discussions we had, and hopefully also be able to formulate some targeted policy advice. Same time, same place, June 9th on Tuesday, 2 o'clock. But I think this won't be the end to the exchange in this setup, because we have seen there's so many other elements and layers to discuss, not only technical but also political. So yeah, thank you very much. You will receive the invitation to next week's seminar, and you will also receive the link to the recording. If you didn't catch all the details, there's an opportunity to hear it all again. Thank you very much to everybody to help realize this seminar, this webinar, to the interpreters and the technical support, and looking forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Have a nice afternoon.